Welcome to this THWACK Camp 2018 session, Backups. Why does it have to be so complicated? I'm Kevin Sparenberg, Technical Content Manager for SolarWinds, and joining me today are a few guests to discuss this topic. Let's meet our panel. Karen, please tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm Karen Lopez. I am a data evangelist, and I go by Data Chick on Twitter.
I'm James Green. I'm at JD Green on Twitter, and I'm a partner at Actual Tech Media, where we create educational content and events for IT professionals.
Hi, I'm Tom, and I kind of work here. You may know me from such things as SolarWinds Lab number 70, but I'm a head geek here at SolarWinds, and I was a production database administrator for 7 years, and I know the pain of reaching for a backup and it wasn't there.
I think we've all kind of shared some of those things, but it's a panel about backups and why they need to be complicated, but we're going to start with a softball question. So what is a backup really?
Well, so I think a backup, I use these things when I talk to both friends of mine and clients, is it's a copy of your data that is off-site, away from your home or your office, that's automatic and that's verified.
Okay. James, agree?
I like the verified part. I imagine we'll go into that discussion more later, but that's an important part to consider about backups. But yeah, basically just another copy of your data other than the production one that you feel confident you're going to be able to restore if something happens to the production copy.
So for me, backup is that thing that it's going to put me back to a point in time. I know, I believe, usually people talk about backups in terms of versions, like put me back to a specific version. So for me, I just think of things in terms of database dumps, and I say, all right, I need to go back and put that database to where it was at 10:30 a.m. yesterday. So to me, do I have a backup that lets me go back to that specific version of my data?
Yeah, but the word backup seems to mean so many things to so many people. I mean, is one copy really all you're talking about? Because it sounds like if I have version control and I go back yesterday 10 a.m. or day before at 9 a.m., is that really enough? Is that enough for a business?
I think there's two questions about how much is enough. First, there is what you're asking about, which is how granular are your backups and exactly when in time can I restore to. The other one is how many copies of the backup am I keeping? There's a standard industry practice called the 3-2-1 rule. It says you want to keep 3 copies of the data, the production copy plus 2 others, on 2 different types of media, and at least one of them is offsite. And that's generally a good way to make sure that you've got at least enough copies to keep you protected.
So I would say to Kevin's question there about is it really enough, my context is usually databases, right? But the database itself is just one component of an application, because an application can have files external to the database. SharePoint is a really good example of this. There are objects outside of a database, but in order for the application to be considered whole, you need to be thinking of a backup as every piece of information that that application needs to get back to that point in time.
Yeah, I've been burnt by that, by an application that had like text files on a server and a database, and they were backing up the database but not the text files. So the database backup did us no good at all because the content wasn't backed up really, and the database just had metadata. And so they put in separate backup systems, but they still weren't in sync. So you could still end up trying to do a restore, but because they weren't done at the same time, it wouldn't work.
Yeah, it sounds like everyone's had some type of nightmare. I mean, that one sounds
50.
bad. Yeah. But I mean, was that like the worst case scenario? Or
Oh no, I got a whole bunch of stories. You want those now or later?
Well, we might as well.
Karen specializes in disasters.
I do.
I thought it was disaster
Creating or fixing?
Troubled projects is what I work on as a project manager.
Okay.
But I have a personal story. I have an employee that destroyed the backups on his way out the door and destroyed local hard disks. And so one of the things I learned about the verified part of my 3-part thing is that you need to verify always that the backups exist, not just after they were taken and not just when you need them. You need to constantly monitor where your backups are, who has access to them. And it's even important for me now to verify the people who were responsible for taking them no longer have access to them until it's time to restore. And I think we're seeing that more in the news lately about disgruntled employees or contractors or something who are doing, holding passwords and that kind of stuff. It's why we need data governance about backups and restores.
I've had experiences like that where it doesn't even have to be malicious, but let's say that, I had a customer once who, called me to parachute in to help them do a restore. We start down the process and realize 9 months ago they backed up some corruption.
Yep.
And they haven't been verifying these backups. So yeah, the job succeeded.
Yep.
They're completing within the backup window. But we went to restore it and find out, oh, the last one we have that is actually any good is from, last year sometime. There was no way to resolve that. They were in big trouble.
So I have a similar story where the last known good one was only 3 weeks ago. So for that company, they only had to re-input 3 weeks worth of transactions, but they had to because there was no other option. The backups had stopped at that point, and we didn't know. The alerts weren't really going off. So that's when I started building alerts to say, are my backups, are they happening? And are they current? Are they available? Like, can I go physically touch that file on disk somewhere right now that I know if I had to, that I could get back without going to tape or recalling a tape from a service, right? Like, I know it's somewhere in my system and I can restore it very easily. And I had to build those things, but I only knew to build those after I had that initial failure. Because believe me, you don't want you get like one chance for the business to tell you, hey, you messed up and you couldn't recover. It's like, yes, this will never happen again, right? You get that one get out of jail free card.
Yeah, it's very similar with alerts. You mentioned that keeping on top of that seems very, very helpful and making sure that you're there for business continuity. But something that's kind of crept up recently, though, not too recently, is the idea of snapshots as backups. Everyone's groaning, kind of, and chuckling.
Laughing. It's a great topic.
Well, yeah, but I mean, are they?
They are to someone.
Okay.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing them, right?
True enough. But I mean, would you consider them a copy of your production, or is this something that you just should avoid, or is it kind of tailored to the business?
I like to think of snapshots as complementary to backups because you could use a snapshot like a backup. I have seen, you go grab something from a snapshot because you could get it faster than you could go and get a backup. But a snapshot doesn't replace a backup.
So I think part of the issue with this is the overloading of terms. Just the term itself, backup, what does backup mean? What does a snapshot mean? So when you say snapshot, I'm like, well, I can do a snapshot of a database itself. Or I could do a snapshot of the VM. Right? So you start, what are you snapshotting? Let's say I snapshot the whole VM. Well, how does that snapshot technology work? Did it stop all the transactions at that moment so I get a transactionally consistent version of my database when I bring it back online? I'm not sure yet, and I don't know without testing. But more importantly, when you did that snapshot, were there any other pieces of the application on other servers that were snapshot at the exact same moment so you're back in time again? So the complexity, I think, of snapshots, there's a lot more complexity to snapshots than I think people realize. I think snapshots are a great way when you're going to do some sort of, say, implement a change, and you just need a quick way to roll back, right? I think database snapshots are really great for that. I want to deploy some code, and did it work or not? If it didn't work, I have a snapshot, and I can revert real quick right now. That's, to me, is where snapshots have the most use and value. If you're relying, though, just on snapshots for backups, well, let's say you do a snapshot of a VM today, so in case you want to roll back today. What are you going to do tomorrow? Another snapshot? There's disk overhead for all these snapshots. So how many snapshots do you plan on keeping around? Is it just one? Is it 7? Like, you might be paying a penalty for the use of a lot of these snapshots without realizing it.
And if you have a 500 terabyte database and system with text files and XML and everything, and you're doing a snapshot, how often? And how long is it going to take to restore, right? Versus an incremental database backup, which can take minutes or something, right?
What's funny about your statement about the overloading of terms is something you didn't mention with regard to snapshots is storage snapshots. And I wasn't even thinking about VM snapshots. I was thinking storage snapshots. So there's even yet another way you could say snapshot and nobody's really actually sure what you mean.
Yeah, well, we've also been talking about database backups and file system level backups, but a lot of times I've seen, at least in my past, sometimes they're not always even the same software. Okay, so is there a reason for that? I mean, for years, we had software that we licensed extra features on so we could use it all in one place, but it always seemed like they needed someone with a specialty in something to make sure it worked.
I think in a lot of organizations, as the requirements change and grow, instead of wholesale ripping everything out and replacing it with one thing that solves the problem, they'll just add one more piece that covers the new problem. And that's how you get to the situation you're describing where you got 5 different backup tools because one backs up the physical servers, one backs up the virtual servers, one backs up some specialty software, you know.
Or one came as part of your licensing deal with one application.
Yeah, it was in they threw it into my ELA as a sweetener, and so I'm going to use it.
And therefore it's free, but you don't realize there's a huge cost to having all these.
It is painful to try to consolidate. There's work involved there, there's cost involved there, but...
And I think it gives an organization a false sense of security that these backups, these random backups, and no one's doing any gap and overlap, and they don't understand that if you're backing up the same data 5 times every 15 minutes, that it might have an impact on performance and everything.
I would just add, you know, if just as you had just stated, how that kind of sprawl happens. Like I need this piece of software, this piece of software, but I think that happens almost throughout IT, because you know you have a monitoring system for your databases, and then one for your network, and then one just for servers, and then one for storage, and that essentially you might hit a point where the biggest consumer of all of IT resources is IT itself, because of all the tools that they have for all the monitoring. And like you just mentioned, 5 different snapshots and backups happening. You got data everywhere, and it's just redundant data that you didn't even need. And it's simply a result of teams not talking to each other and being like, hey, they threw this software in with my agreement, so let's just use it.
The other great thing is that like the purchasing officer, she's going to be like, oh, it's backup software, I better renew that. Like I just got a maintenance bill, I better do that, because the last time I went and asked, should we renew this, it didn't get renewed, and we lost a bunch of data.
So not only IT has to get burned once, it seems like the people in procurements also have to. Yeah, but that technology sprawl that you're talking about, Tom, whether it's for monitoring, but specifically for backups, it seems like you've got, well, you mentioned you got licensing fees going different places, you've got potentially different hardware to run all this gear, you've got, you know, different infrastructure, different software. I mean, that kind of defeats the purpose of keeping things simple, stupid, right?
Well, let's add more complexity to this. Okay. So here's a question for you. How are you backing up your Microsoft Access databases right now? Oh, better question. Where did those Access databases sit? Oh, right next to the Excel files on somebody's desktop.
Or laptop.
Or laptop, or on a USB stick. Yeah. But where are these files, where are these business critical applications actually sitting? It's a spreadsheet on somebody's desktop. Are you backing up those desktops every night? Yeah. Maybe. Maybe you're not. And so how are you making sure that this application can go back to that specific version if you need to restore or recover? And you might not even be backing up because it's sitting on somebody's desktop somewhere.
Well, that begs the question, should backups be everywhere? Should you be backing up workstations? I remember years ago there was an argument, hey, we've got roaming profiles, we'll just use them and make everyone work off of shared drives. But then we had latency arguments and IT was back and forth, and then people ended up keeping stuff on their desktop and then had to buy a desktop backup software in addition to the corporate backup software.
You had to hire 3 FTEs to troubleshoot roaming profiles.
Yeah, or the backup software that was separate from the enterprise level stuff we were using elsewhere. So the sprawl, I think, goes everywhere.
Yep.
All right. Well, that kind of leads into building a plan. Because, I mean, we've said we need to make sure we have backups for this type of content, for this type of content, for this type of content. So what really goes into building a cohesive plan for your organization?
Gosh, I wish I knew. No. So for me as a data person, the first thing is you have to know what data you have, what its importance is, what its sensitivity is. Like even backups have sensitivity issues, right? Like should they be encrypted? Should we be allowed to back it up off-site? What type of off-site things? Like all of those. So you have to have a data inventory. And by data, I mean files and scripts and everything, metadata, everything. So that's the hard part, is knowing where your data is, knowing where it really is, not just where people are told it is. Like, yeah, we have things like OneDrive and Dropbox, and oh, they back up themselves. Well, no, they don't really. And by the way, if that company goes out of business, you might not get access to those backups, right? And then we don't know about bring your own, people who are storing their files, putting them in a bucket somewhere on the cloud. That's how end users are backing up now, and that's how we have data breaches. So if you have that inventory, then you can look at your data as a whole and try to figure out where your gaps and overlaps of backup are, and how timely it has to be, how granular it has to be, and what your legal and compliance issues are. And then you get to go and do the technical part of solving a business problem.
How does a business even begin to gather all of that? I mean, what you're asking for is
I can see
wow, I don't even.
So there are tools that go out and help you find data, right? They find databases, they find spreadsheets, they help you profile it, they help you see if credit card data is being shared on a shared folder somewhere on a shared server that was supposed to hold resumes or something like that. There's that kind of thing, but there's also this concept of, and I know it's really hard, trying to get business processes to understand that data, they have a stewardship obligation to take care of it, not just to make it right or to make it available, but to make it available when something goes wrong. So it really is part of holding someone else's data, or the most important data you're coming. We've all read these stories about how businesses had to shut down because someone wasn't backing up or couldn't restore, like retail establishments, some small banks, some political parties or candidates who lost all their data. Like, we can just watch those and see why it's important that we spend that time. And I get that we won't always find that because data involves humans and humans can't be trusted, but there is that problem.
Karen has trust issues.
I have trust issues. Don't trust anyone with the data. It's a hard part. It's a hard part.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of tools at our disposal today to solve the problem technically and architecturally.
And that's not the
really
hardest
hard part
one.
is, understanding the requirements, understanding the scope of what needs to be protected. Mm-hmm. That's the really hard part.
So, but it's hard to figure out all the specific tasks. I won't disagree with that, but neither of you have mentioned a couple of things that I want to make sure everybody's aware of. So the first thing is the first requirement, and it's easy to remember. If you can't recover, you can't keep your job. This is your life in IT. Like, you get one get out of jail free card. But if you consistently, if you're having issues with the recovery, then why are we paying you to be here, right? So that's first and foremost. I always tell people, day zero as a DBA, that's job one, is if you can't recover, you can't keep your job. That's what you focus on to start with, and then you work your way from there. So the two terms you really haven't mentioned yet are RPO and RTO. So if you're going to build a plan, you need to know things. So RPO is recovery point objective. RTO is recovery time objective. So recovery point, at what point do you need to go back to? Do I have to be able to get you to? And how recovery time is, how long do I have to do that for you? So if I'm taking, in my case, a database, right, transaction log backups every 15 minutes, but if it takes me longer than 15 minutes to restore that transaction log backup, like, I have a problem. So you need to go to the business and say, all right, so for this application, what's the RPO, what's the RTO? If they can't answer that, they need to find the answer, or you need to tell them what their RPO and RTO is going to be. And then you have to meet that consistently. So that means you need to be practicing your restores, your recovery plan, right? So don't build a backup plan, build a recovery plan and say, all right, I need to be able to go to point in time, and the point in time is a granularity that requires me to do transaction log backups. Okay, I'll do those every 15 minutes. They only take so much time to restore. Here's your RPO and RTO that I can promise you. Now, data grows over time. So you have to keep practicing your restores and say, all right, how am I continuing to meet the SLAs? Because as data grows, you'll find that you might hit a point where you become too big to fail over, right? There's this massive volume of data and you haven't really tested anything in even 6 months. And all of a sudden somebody says, hey, let's just do this and move the data around. And actually, that would take forever at this point. Like, you have to constantly be testing this recovery plan that you have in order to make sure you consistently meet those SLAs. So RPO and RTO, that's where you start with to build your recovery plan.
I found a helpful way to get to the bottom of those questions, because sometimes it's difficult to get the people that need to answer those questions to tell you.
Sometimes difficult.
What's your RPO?
Yeah.
It may seem a little cynical, but the way I like to ask the question is, how much data are you willing to lose?
That's right.
And how long are you willing to wait?
But the answers become no data And I
course,
don't want to wait at all.
It's all on a spectrum, and
And the thing is, it's not a question about all their data. You have to do it by sections or pieces of data, and not just application-wide, but actually data. Because the other question isn't just which data or how fast. Is like, well, if we couldn't get you data from 10 years ago, if it's going to take two days to get that back, is that okay? Because now we can architect our system so that we can get this year's data back in 15 minutes or an hour, whatever it is. Like, we can architect systems so that we can meet their RPO and their RTO, not just treating all the data as one massive blob of data.
But James' approach is exactly the way you have to do. That's how you have to frame the questions so they can understand it. And of course, the answers really are, I don't want to lose any data. And so in my experience, when I did try to do that, I knew that we had data that wasn't ever going to be used except for some ad hoc query. So just a report. And it'd be a report against data from years ago. And I'd say, so would it be okay if you needed that took a day? Because I'd recall from tape and you could run it. No, when I need it, I need it. Are you sure about that?
Like, how much, where's your budget?
Are you really sure about what, because that's what that means is we have to do, and they're like, well, that's what it takes. Okay. To me, it was fairly wasteful for just somebody not willing to wait a period of time. And I get it, we all have needs, but it's hard to get the real answer, because if you tell people, if you give them the option, then you're going to get back, no, it has to be immediate, and it has to be all of it.
They'll tell you at their next recovery or their next budget cycle, one of those two things, they'll tell you the real answer.
Yeah, but doesn't HA or disaster recovery plans, doesn't that mitigate this entire discussion? Because if I'm HA, I'll never lose anything ever.
I was just going to bring that up, that you haven't brought up HA. So the thing I tell people is that as much as we might laugh at that, there's a little bit of truth to that. So in the olden days, if a hard drive failed, we failed and we had to restore. Nowadays, we have HA, so if a node or a hard drive fails, we don't have to do a restore. So we have mitigated some requirements for restores. But I do get all the time, we have HA, so we don't need to do backups. We'll just add, if you really feel bad about it, let's just add 10 more nodes. And I'm like, it doesn't solve the problem. And even if your HA is in the cloud, it's still all in one place, all in one format, which doesn't meet your tasks of copies in different places and in different formats.
That's also really only accounting for infrastructure failures, and when you get slapped with ransomware, I don't care how good your HA is.
Or running a query without the where clause. Like, it doesn't handle that you've accidentally changed, or a load failed. It doesn't handle accidental data failures.
HA is really great at taking something bad and making it bad everywhere, all at once.
It does that too.
So
both.
Your case of ransomware is a great example, but database corruption. And you say, no, I have HA, we're using availability groups and we'll be fine. Everything's, HA is our solution and we don't really have to worry about disaster because we'll have copies of the data everywhere. And I go, so great, you get corruption, now you have corruption everywhere. How are you gonna fix that? And the answer is, well, we'll restore from backups. Okay, that's your DR plan. That's your recovery plans to restore from a backup. HA is not a recovery plan, it's something completely different. But people oftentimes say, no, it's HA, it's good enough, we won't really have to work. Once I have HA, I won't need DR. Oh, that's the wrong answer.
And the thing with high availability is those people who think it's perfect for disaster recovery also tend to be the people that think snapshots are backups and recovery. So you end up with this, like, maybe once a day, daily snapshot and HA and some sort of failover availability group or something, and they think that's enough. So they tend to lean in that direction and not for the point in time and not thinking about how long to restore. So it's a big obstacle to people who don't understand the difference between those.
I like the way you highlight recovery. What's your recovery plan? And I think a good way to think about it is snapshots and HA are your availability plan. So first we can start with how do we keep things available, and then if that doesn't work, now let's go to recovery.
That's right. That's a great way.
Okay. So what do people then look for in a backup solution? I mean, there's probably a lot of tick marks for this, but
a recovery solution. That's what you look up in a backup.
Don't look for a backup. Yeah, look for a recovery solution.
You don't need backups. You only need a restore. Okay. No one needs backups. They just need restores, if that's how you think about it.
Okay.
Well,
I'll throw the first requirement out there. I think it's important to understand what's out there and what the state of it is. So one of the first things I want in a backup tool is for it to give me a good look at everything that I'm protecting, how protected it is right now, and how far back I'm protected, when I'm next going to be protected, stuff like that. But a comprehensive look at the landscape of everything I'm trying to protect is really important to me. So there's other technical factors that are important, maybe we'll get into, but that's like top of my list. What am I protecting, and what's the status of it across as much as possible of my IT landscape?
So I can agree to that. I go one step further. And how long would it take me to recover that?
I'm with you.
Right? So are my backups current? What's protected right now? What's the state? How far back can I go? And by the way, if I had to recover that, how long would that take? And then next to that, knowing my RPOs and RTOs and saying, am I still in compliance of what I've promised the business?
For me, I always ran into problems where the backups seemed more complex than the systems I was architecting that the backups are going to run with. So I think simple is one of these things that should probably also be added, or as simple as possible for some of these things, because there are underlying technologies that can be taken advantage of, VSS in the Microsoft world. There's a lot of things that work off of snapshots, either data, disk, or VM, so we could work with some of that information. But simple is the one for me, because I had to run, we had one for Exchange. We had a different tool for SQL. We had yet a different tool for file systems. We had yet a different tool for the actual workstations, and it just ended up being trying to get a single report out of that to understand, what is the actual status of my backup and my possible recovery windows. It was impossible to gauge.
And when it comes to RTO, complexity is a serious risk. I mean, if all of a sudden you're in panic mode and you're trying to restore and it's just this complex mess, I see your RTO window growing.
Yeah, it's going to take us a day to recover. Well, we don't have a day. We can't just close the business for a day. Well, okay. We're offline right now.
Get paper and pencil. That's my recovery.
I mean, there've been incidents over the years where we've seen a company, something happens on a Monday morning, there's a fire in the data center, and they have to make a decision, like, we're offline right now, it could take us 6 hours to recover, or we could just reboot everything, and we know for certain it's 8 hours. And they'll make that decision no matter the disruption that could cause. They're basically offline for most of a day, but at least they know they're going to come back, as opposed to trying to fight the fire and say, all right, this piece, see how long, maybe we'll be back online 6 hours. You don't want that. You want to know RTO, how long will it take, make that decision. Okay, I know for a fact if I push this button, it's within 8 hours, and we'll just work with that. That's better than just being like, hey, we don't have that time right now. Well, if you don't have that time right now, then we've been doing things wrong for many, many months or years to get to a point where you're at such a disconnect, and I tell you it's going to take a day, and you say, no, that's not good enough. If you hit that point, it's game over. Yeah.
And I think that's the perfect example of, you didn't use the word business, but that whole discussion was, what does the business need here? It's not a technical question, right? It's does it need certainty over shortest time, but more risk, like cost, benefit, and risk. I'm always coming back to that and everything, cost, benefit, and risk. One of the other things that I thought that you guys mentioned was that you need to engineer out the complexity of resuming business, because you can tolerate some backup complexity, but when it comes time to bring your business back up and running, that's where you need predictability. You have to know how long it takes to restore. You have to know where everything is. You have to know what versions work with which. That's where people should be practicing and driving out the complexity is at restoration time, not at the backup time. It should be in both, but really, I never hear anyone talking about, or technical people who roll their eyes or like, we have to practice again a restore. I know how to do a restore. You should be doing this like at home while you're binge watching Netflix.
It should be automated.
It should be automated, but you making the process work, whatever that is, if it's pushing a button or asking Alexa, I'll say that right, asking Cortana to do the restore.
Before we leave, I forget this, I want to make sure one thing's clear. The only way to know if a backup is good is to practice a restore. So if you're not practicing restores, you have no idea if those backups have value, right? They're just files on a disk somewhere. Like, it just doesn't help. Right now, I have a a backup of my research paper from when I was in grad school on a 3.5-inch floppy disk.
Yay.
It's fairly useless to me at this point. Like, where am I going to use it?
Have you had it bronzed yet?
I haven't had it bronzed. I've got a
bronze.
floppy disk just sitting with all of my research from years of research, and it's doing me no good right now, right? So you have to be practicing those resources. That's the only way you're going to know that backup works.
Or the system.
Or the system works.
So it sounds more like business continuity planning more than disaster.
Is that what we call it now? Yeah. That's what
I've
I
heard.
call it.
Yeah.
That's if you want the big bucks, you call it business continuity planning. That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
That's a fancy term for DR.
Because it doesn't have to
You
be
can
a
charge double for it.
disaster
You
can charge
to need to
double.
restore.
Yes, you can just have a single system have a problem, and that's not necessarily a disaster,
One
depending on the
update
business.
query.
Yeah.
Was it a disaster? Well, it was to the data, but the rest of the business is thinking.
Disaster versus an event. Was that a-
Incident.
it wasn't a
Incident. Everything's an
disaster.
incident in media training. It was an incident.
All right. So you mentioned the 3-2-1 scenario where you have one that's offsite. Now, when I was coming up in IT, offsite meant take a tape, a physical tape, stick it in a box, put that box in a corner for someone to pick up and take out somewhere for storage. But everything's cloud now. I mean, do we have to worry about, can we use cloud as a viable option for off-prem?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think that it's a great option, especially for either stuff that may be more archive type of data, or if you're building apps that are running in the cloud, why not back them up local to where they're running? There's no need, in a lot of cases, to back up an app that's running in the cloud to your on-prem backup solution if there's a way you can back it up right next to where it's at. So I think there's a lot of good reasons to back up in the cloud. I think there's also a challenge with backing up in the cloud. Well, there's a number of challenges to backing up in the cloud. One of them is, I think that people tend to use the cloud as a way to abdicate responsibility.
Responsibility as a service, right?
Yeah, yes, that's exactly what people do. They say, this is the cloud's problem now. I think especially in the case of backups, that could be very dangerous. That is absolutely still your responsibility. So yes, by all means, use the cloud as a backup repository, or back up your apps that are running in the cloud. But you still need to consider all the things we've already talked about when it comes to backups.
Yeah, so I would piggyback on that and just say, look, backups to the cloud are, I think, the way to go, because it's usually far cheaper for me to have storage in the cloud than it is for me to try to host all this on site in my own data center. It just usually is. But the word of caution becomes, even by doing that, you have to practice that recovery. So I've talked about this before, where now it's all about the network. So are you on the Azure Express route? Because if you're not, so that backup might have completed, and it could be taking however long, maybe you're looking at that, but how long is it going to take you to recover that data? Is Azure going to get you that data as fast as you need it to, or AWS, or whatever cloud you're using? Is that cloud provider going to be able to get you the agreement you have right now? Can they meet the SLA that your business has? So it's one extra layer of complexity that you need to consider. And that's why testing that restore process is really important when you're using cloud.
And especially if someone's used something like Glacier or one of the really slow restores, because it's so affordable. Again, the cost, benefit, and risk. Yeah. I love those things because you can just put all your cat pictures up there and all your videos and everything of rocket launches and everything up there. And what do you pay? Like pennies a month for that? And I know that if I lose all the backups I have on site and my other off-site ones, that it's still there. And if I really need it, I can pay that extra money and that extra time to get it back. Mm-hmm. But I've seen people try to implement these highly affordable, very slow, very expensive to restore solutions, thinking they're going to use it for their dev backups where they're tearing down machines and bringing it back, and they don't realize that they haven't done the cost, benefit, and risk.
Okay. Well, the cloud seems like a viable solution, but what about other SaaS-based apps? You mentioned that if we are building things in the cloud, we should just back up the cloud. But if we're actually getting a software as a service from somebody, should they include backup? Is there something we need to worry about? Is it a question we need to make sure the business asks?
Well, absolutely, because whatever service you're being provided, if you have an issue with that service, how are you going to put it back to that point in time? Where's your versioning? right? So that's something, whatever service it is, you have to ask, say, so what's the recovery restore policy and how does this happen? And they may tell you, oh, don't worry about it, it's automatic, or we can put you back to whatever point in time you want, or we don't do that, or you pay extra for it. But then the next question, does it include everything? Is any data possibly lost? Do you really recover stuff? Or is there some piece of data that might be missing? If you're not asking that question, you could put yourself at risk.
Yeah, very much so. Like the financial software I use is an online SaaS-based thing. And when I asked about backups, they're like, yep, we follow industry standards, but they don't actually give you. So what you're really paying for, like that outsourced responsibility, is an SLA, like a service level agreement that says that, you know, they've got some sort of number that is not the normal way I measure recovery. You know, it just says, we guarantee that your data is backed up. I'm like, great. So you're paying to recover all that data if I need it, and you do something that's not there. The other thing is, you talk about paying more, but rarely in software as a service can you just say, I now want hourly backups. Like, you can't piecemeal it. You can't say, like, you know, maybe my company needs this, or my industry I'm in requires this. You basically buy an upgraded enterprise service level of software just to get finer granularity, or more. Maybe sometimes you're only allowed to recover 3 times a year, 4 times a year within that service level. So you can't really, you know, you can't just buy that one backup. So it's a trade-off, cost, benefit, and risk again.
You have to be careful when you're evaluating those two about the granularity of what they're promising you, because, you know, like so with your financial software example, if the systems fail and they promise that they can recover from yesterday, okay, great. If something happens in software, or there's a infection, something, and nothing failed and no systems are down, but your transactions are all bungled, what do they offer you there? You may not know,
nothing.
Maybe they don't offer anything, but the granularity of the SLA is important, especially, I think, in SaaS apps.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, this particular company doesn't even allow me to export my data, so I couldn't even set up some sort of automated thing. What they say is, you can generate the reports and print them out.
Yeah, but they don't have the export to CSV button. The most
They don't have
popular
anything.
button in all of
And everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you also mentioned the financial stuff. Now that we've got GDPR everywhere, kind of, that's changing the way people are looking at backups and who has access. I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about that, but I've gone through the basics trainings. But how would that really affect people, you know, either people who's been in the industry for a while who are now have to worry about backups and are being affected by something like this?
So one of the interesting parts about GDPR, the privacy, the data protection regulation right now in the EU, but other countries have already announced that they will be adopting similar regulations. So it's not just a GDPR problem, is this right to be forgotten, which includes in your backups potentially. Like, we're gonna wait to see these test cases about what do you do if a customer says, forget me, and forget me for everything that you've collected about me ever. Like, think about that, those tapes somewhere.
I'm trying not to think about
that.
I
know.
Because I'm going old school here.
So
Yeah, you're
it's
gonna
not
have to go get
quite
the
that
tape.
simple, but that
No.
is something that a backup and retention strategy has to look at, is legal and
But
compliance
the
issues.
real problem with that is that you could say, well, legally, you have to comply with my right to be forgotten. And then there's also the argument, but legally, I need to put things back
That's
in
right.
case of something gone wrong. And if I get called to court and they say, well, how did things look at this day? I need to also show a trail there as well. And your
Right.
information might be there.
Right.
So these companies that are hosting this data are kind of going to be stuck.
And there's a little bit more wiggle room there. It's not a legal term, right? It is in my case. Anyway, wiggle room for how that's going to work, and there's a lot of complexities. We'll see how it works. But one of the other interesting thing is what if your backups weren't encrypted? Because, you know, we did it that way for a long time. But now the data's sitting there. So do you go back and restore and then encrypt your backups, or do you encrypt the backup files themselves? And what do you do with all those keys and all that other stuff? Do you back up your keys and certificates, and do you do it in the same place the data is, or do you find the backup key, encryption key from 10 years ago so that you can restore it?
Yeah.
Did I just depress the heck out of it?
Yeah. I think we've all had a horror story or two like that. I mean, I started out.
Lost keys.
Yeah, lost keys just make me want to write 3 letters. But I've frequently, like, I came from an Exchange background, and I know on-prem mailbox backups. I know how to do them. I know how to do restores, probably with 3 or 4 different pieces of software over the years of working with it, but there's a huge migration push to like Office 365, and Microsoft says, well, you don't have to worry about availability, and this is where you mentioned there's a difference between availability and recovery. So, I mean, is this something you need to necessarily worry about? I mean, I try not to delete mail that I shouldn't delete, but I think we've all accidentally deleted a thing or two.
Or
this falls into
users,
this.
or accounts.
Yeah.
Or groups.
Entire mailbox.
Groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, things happen.
Organizations, yeah. So one of the great things, from what I know about O365 is, you delete, but it's not really deleted. There's a trash can, whatever, a folder, a delete folder. And then there's a secret one that people can't see. But then once it falls out of there, unless you've paid for a bigger plan to get the security and compliance record retention thing, then it's gone and you can't. So I'm working with a client right now where we are turning on some of that compliance thing because, again, we had a trust issue with a leaving system administrator who went and deleted a bunch of stuff that she shouldn't have. So this is why maybe there's a 321.1, which is don't rely on trusting people for your backup service.
Again with the trust issues.
Again with the trust issue.
It comes full circle.
The thing is, does everyone want to pay for that? Again, you don't just pay for that little extra, you pay for a bigger enterprise plan to get these compliance, that are usually for larger organizations. So some people are doing their records retention outside of O365 so that they can manage that backup and not rely on software as a service to do that.
I think coming back to backup software requirements, even before you get to the right to be forgotten, to even understand if you're compliant with GDPR at all, you have to understand what you have, what's out there.
First step.
And that's a challenge with a lot of backup architectures is, I can't even tell you if I'm compliant because I don't know what's out there and
Or what was in the backups of a VM.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a problem a lot of people have to figure out right now, but we can at least be thinking about that moving forward.
I can help you with that.
There's
That's what I do.
money to be made in solving that problem.
Yes.
So I've heard.
All right, so that pretty much wraps us for time. Our final thoughts from anyone?
Sure. I'll remind people, if you can't recover, you can't keep your job, and that backups, it's like Schrodinger's backup, right? You don't know the state of that backup until you try to restore it.
If I had a parting piece of advice, it would be to always be focusing on engineering complexity out of your backup architectures and understanding where you're at any given point in time with all of your data. How protected is it? What's protected? Because that's what's going to be really important when it comes time to use it.
So I think if you really love your data, you'll make sure that you're engineering the stupid out of the backups, like he said, that you know where your data is, what data you have, and that you're going to consider it your first job. The first point of your job is to secure the data and make sure it's available to the business because it is the business these days.
So I'd like to thank my guests, Tom, James, and Karen, for a lively discussion on backup. And thanks to all of you for watching. For THWACK Camp 2018, I'm Kevin Sparenberg.